For over 3,000 years, a single institution shaped one of the most enduring civilizations in human history, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. More than just kings, they were believed to be gods in human form, rulers who built pyramids, commanded armies, and spoke for the divine. But who were they, really? And how did their reigns reflect not only power and splendor, but also fragility, ambition, and constant reinvention? This is not just the story of famous names carved in stone: Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Cleopatra. It is the story of a political and religious system that endured for millennia, adapting to crisis and change, repeatedly rising from collapse. From the unification of the Nile Valley to the fall of Cleopatra and the arrival of Roman rule, the tale of Egypt's pharaohs is one of innovation, ideology, conflict, and continuity. In this full documentary, we will follow the complete arc of pharaonic Egypt, from its mysterious origins in pre-dynastic times to its final centuries under foreign domination. We will explore the turning points, the towering personalities, the wars and reforms, and the ideas that held this ancient state together across centuries. This is the entire story of the Egyptian pharaohs, told not as myth, but as history. Let's begin. Long before the towering pyramids and golden tombs, before names like Rameses or Cleopatra etched themselves into history, the land we now call Egypt was a patchwork of independent villages scattered along the Nile. Life in these early communities revolved around the river's predictable flood cycle, which brought both water and fertile soil. People farmed, fished, crafted simple tools, and buried their dead with care, leaving behind clues in pottery, ornaments, and early graves. But they had no kings, no written records, and no grand temples. The age of the pharaohs had not yet begun. This prehistoric period, often called the pre-dynastic era, stretched back thousands of years before the unification of Egypt. Archaeologists divide it into phases, the most important of which is the Naqada culture, centered in Upper Egypt, the southern part of the Nile Valley. By the late 4th millennium BCE, the Naqada people had developed significant social complexity. They traded goods over long distances, crafted sophisticated pottery and art, and buried their elites in elaborate tombs. At the same time, Lower Egypt in the north was home to different cultures with their own customs and burial styles. These regional differences are important. They show that Egypt was not always one unified civilization. It was a land of many local powers, each vying for influence. Over time, however, a pattern emerged. Larger settlements began to dominate their neighbors, absorbing land, labor, and resources. One of these southern centers, Hierakonpolis, known in ancient times as Nekhen, rose to prominence. Excavations there have revealed large cemeteries, industrial zones, and even a ceremonial temple, all dating to centuries before the first official dynasty. It was here that signs of kingship first appeared, including early royal iconography like crowns, scepters, and falcon symbols, later associated with Horus, the sky god and patron of the king. Why did this process of political unification begin? Part of the answer lies in environmental and economic pressures. As population grew and arable land became more valuable, competition between regional leaders intensified. Trade routes, control over irrigation, and access to vital materials like gold and copper became sources of power. In this landscape, leaders who could organize labor, manage surplus, and protect territory gained an edge. Their authority expanded, and with it, new forms of social and political hierarchy took shape. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, Upper Egypt had produced a line of powerful proto-kings, sometimes referred to as the Dynasty Zero or the Naqada III rulers. These kings left behind inscriptions, royal tombs, and symbols that show many of the classic elements of later pharaonic rule were already forming. The most famous artifact from this era is the Narmer palette. Discovered at Hierakonpolis, the Narmer palette is a carved ceremonial stone showing a king, believed to be Narmer, wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. On one side, Narmer is shown striking down an enemy, a pose that would become iconic in Egyptian royal art. On the other side, rows of decapitated foes lie beneath his feet. Above them, the intertwined necks of two mythical beasts suggest the joining of two lands. This symbolic language, though still primitive, speaks to a profound political event, the unification of Egypt under a single ruler. Most historians place this event around 3100 BCE. Narmer, or perhaps a king named Menes, whose name appears in later king lists, completed the process of uniting Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. Whether they were two names for the same individual or separate rulers is still debated, but what matters is the legacy. With unification came the founding of Egypt's first dynasty and the creation of a centralized state with a king at its head. This new institution of kingship was unlike anything seen before in the region. The king, or Pharaoh, as he would later be called, was not merely a political leader. He was a divine figure, the earthly embodiment of Horus and the upholder of Ma'at, the principle of balance, order, and justice. His role was cosmic, not just administrative. His actions ensured the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and the world would remain in harmony. The early kings built tombs at Abydos, a sacred city in Upper Egypt, establishing it as the royal necropolis of the first dynasty. These tombs were surrounded by smaller graves for courtiers and retainers, some of whom may have been sacrificed to accompany the king into the afterlife. It was a brutal but revealing sign of how absolute the king's authority was believed to be. The first and second dynasties, collectively known as the early dynastic period, saw the consolidation of royal power, the development of hieroglyphic writing, and the establishment of key religious and political institutions. The capital was moved to Memphis, near the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, allowing the king to administer his newly unified realm more effectively. From this base, pharaohs began issuing decrees, collecting taxes, and commissioning monumental architecture on a modest scale at first, but growing in ambition with each generation. Much of what we know about these early kings comes from archaeology and later king lists, such as the Palermo stone and the Abydos king list. Names like Narmer, Aha, Jair, and Den emerge from both tombs and inscriptions, though details about their reigns remain limited. What is clear, however, is that by the end of the second dynasty, the foundations of the Egyptian state were firmly in place. Kingship had become central to Egyptian identity. The pharaoh was the mediator between gods and people, the symbol of unity in a land defined by duality, upper and lower, life and death, order and chaos. This idea would persist for millennia, evolving but never disappearing as new dynasties rose and fell. What began as a collection of villages along a river had become something entirely new. A centralized kingdom ruled by a god-king, supported by a bureaucratic class, and organized around a powerful set of religious and political ideas. This was the birth of one of the most enduring institutions in world history. The age of the pyramids was just around the corner. When Egypt entered the Old Kingdom, it did so with a firm foundation of centralized rule, divine kingship, and administrative control. But this period, beginning with the Third Dynasty around 2700 BCE, did more than build on what came before. It elevated pharaonic authority to monumental heights. This was the era of the pyramids, and with them, the pharaoh became not just a king of the people, but a god among gods. The Old Kingdom, often called the Age of the Pyramids, spanned the 3rd through 6th dynasties. Its political heart lay in the city of Memphis, strategically located where Upper and Lower Egypt meet. From here, the pharaoh ruled as the absolute head of a complex system of government, religion, economy, and labor. Unlike the experimental phase of the early dynastic period, the Old Kingdom was confident, structured, and deeply ideological. It began with a transformative figure, King Djoser. Djoser ruled during the Third Dynasty and is best remembered for commissioning Egypt's first pyramid. Prior to his reign, royal tombs were rectangular, flat-roofed structures called mastabas. But Djoser's chief architect and vizier, a man named Imhotep, had a bold new vision. He stacked 6 mastabas of decreasing size on top of each other, creating what is now known as the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. This structure was more than just a tomb. It was a symbol of divine ascent, a stairway to the heavens, reflecting the king's journey from the earthly realm to the afterlife. It also signaled the scale of power that pharaohs could now wield. The Step Pyramid complex was surrounded by courtyards, temples, and ceremonial structures, all enclosed within a massive limestone wall. It was one of the earliest examples of large-scale stone architecture in human history. Djoser's pyramid set a precedent. His successors expanded on the idea, refining both the symbolic meaning and the engineering techniques. The true flowering of pyramid building came during the Fourth Dynasty, a line of kings whose ambition, wealth, and command over labor were unmatched. The dynasty began with Sneferu, often called the greatest builder in Egyptian history. Sneferu was not content with a single pyramid. He built at least 3. His first attempt at Medum was experimental and ultimately unstable. At Dashur, he constructed the so-called bent pyramid, which begins at a steep angle and then abruptly changes halfway up due to structural concerns. Finally, he completed the Red Pyramid, Egypt's first successful smooth-sided pyramid. It set the template for everything that followed. Why did Sneferu invest so heavily in these massive constructions? It was not merely about tombs. The pyramids were statements of divine authority, demonstrating the pharaoh's power to marshal resources and uphold Mahat, the universal order. Building a pyramid required thousands of workers, meticulous planning, and a vast network of supply chains. Stone had to be quarried, transported, and precisely cut. Workers needed food, shelter, tools, and organization. To coordinate this effort, Egypt relied on an expanding bureaucracy led by scribes, overseers, and high officials, all serving the pharaoh. The Fourth Dynasty reached its architectural climax under Sneferu's son, Khufu. Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, built the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest stone structure ever erected. Standing originally at over 480 feet high, the pyramid used an estimated 2.3 million blocks of limestone and granite. Its construction remains a subject of intense study, but there is no credible evidence for the use of slave labor. Instead, seasonal laborers, perhaps farmers working during the Nile flood season, formed a skilled and rotating workforce. The scale of the Great Pyramid was not simply a display of wealth. It reflected the ideology that the king was eternal, divine, and inseparable from the cosmic order. The pyramid's orientation, internal layout, and funerary complex all served ritual functions tied to solar and celestial beliefs. Khufu's pyramid was part of a broader mortuary landscape, including temples and smaller pyramids for queens and royal family members. Khufu's son, Djedefre, built his pyramid farther north at Abu Rawash, though little remains today. More significant was the reign of Khafre, who constructed the second pyramid at Giza, and is likely the pharaoh behind the Great Sphinx, a colossal, lion-bodied statue with a human head, thought to bear Khafre's likeness. The Sphinx, carved directly from bedrock, guarded the Giza plateau and became an enduring symbol of royal power and mystery. Menkaure, the last major king of the Fourth Dynasty, built the smallest of the 3 Giza pyramids. While his monument was more modest in size, it continued the established traditions of mortuary architecture and cult practice. By the time the Fifth Dynasty began, the focus of royal ideology began to shift subtly. While the pyramids remained central, new religious developments emerged. The cult of the sun god Ra became increasingly prominent, and kings began calling themselves sons of Ra. This period saw the construction of sun temples in addition to pyramids. These open-air complexes featured obelisks and altars, emphasizing the king's connection to the solar deity. This theological shift influenced the nature of kingship. Earlier pharaohs had stressed their identity as Horus, the falcon god, ruling as the living embodiment of divine authority. Now, they were more explicitly cast as intermediaries between gods and people. Texts from this era, such as the pyramid texts found in the Pyramid of Unas, the last king of the 5th dynasty, offer the earliest known religious writings in Egypt. These inscriptions detailed the king's journey to the afterlife, filled with spells, rituals, and poetic invocations. They provide critical insight into ancient Egyptian beliefs about death, rebirth, and divine kingship. The 6th dynasty marked the twilight of the Old Kingdom. It began under King Teti and included significant rulers such as Pepi I and Pepi II. The latter's reign is especially notable. It may have lasted over 90 years, one of the longest in history. But longevity did not guarantee stability. By the end of Pepi II's rule, signs of decline were becoming clear. One cause was the growing power of local governors, or nomarchs. As the central government struggled to maintain control, these officials became increasingly independent, building their own tombs and passing titles to their heirs. Economic strains, possibly linked to low Nile floods, added pressure. The vast resources once devoted to pyramid construction were now harder to mobilize. Meanwhile, the royal court became entangled in palace intrigues and succession disputes. By the close of the 6th dynasty, the authority of the pharaoh had eroded. Egypt entered a period of fragmentation and crisis, known as the First Intermediate Period. Yet, the legacy of the Old Kingdom endured. The pyramids of Giza stood as eternal monuments to a time when the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a god incarnate. The ideology, art, and administrative practices of this period would influence Egyptian civilization for centuries. The grandeur of the Old Kingdom had once seemed eternal, embodied in the massive stone pyramids and the unwavering image of a divine pharaoh. Yet by the close of the 6th dynasty, that image had begun to fracture. What followed was a time of instability, uncertainty, and regional conflict, a period historians refer to as the First Intermediate Period. Spanning roughly from 2100 BCE to 2000 BCE, this era was not a complete collapse of civilization, but rather a decentralization of power and a profound transformation in Egyptian society. The transition into this period was gradual, marked by the slow erosion of central authority. During the reign of Pepi II, one of Egypt's longest-reigning monarchs, the royal government became increasingly unable to exert effective control over the provinces. The power vacuum left behind allowed local officials, known as nomarchs, to gain autonomy. These governors had once been appointed by the king, but over time, their offices became hereditary. They began to act as independent rulers, collecting taxes, organizing labor, and commissioning their own monuments. This fragmentation of authority meant that Egypt was no longer governed as a unified state. Instead, it became a collection of local powers, each managing its own affairs. Some regions, especially in Upper Egypt, around the cities of Heracleopolis and Thebes, grew particularly influential. At times, rival factions from these cities claimed legitimacy over all of Egypt, but their control rarely extended beyond a portion of the Nile Valley. The lack of a strong central government had tangible consequences. The state no longer organized large-scale construction projects, and the vast administrative apparatus of the Old Kingdom disintegrated. With it went the food distribution systems that had helped buffer rural communities during times of drought or crop failure. Some Egyptologists argue that a series of unusually low Nile floods may have worsened the situation, leading to famine, displacement, and social unrest. Written records from this period are limited, but some texts offer a glimpse into the mood of the time. The Admonitions of Ipuwer, a poetic lament from this era, describes a world turned upside down. The rich have become poor, the poor have seized power, and chaos reigns. While the text is likely rhetorical and may exaggerate conditions, it captures a broader sense of disorder and anxiety that defined the age. In the north, the city of Heracleopolis emerged as a political center. Kings of the 9th and 10th dynasties ruled from here, asserting control over Lower Egypt and parts of Middle Egypt. However, their influence was limited, and their rule was often challenged. These kings are poorly documented in the archaeological record, and few of their names are well known today. In the south, a different power was rising, Thebes. Originally a minor city, Thebes grew rapidly in political and military strength during this period. The rulers of the 11th dynasty, beginning with Intef I, began to assert themselves as legitimate kings of Egypt. They expanded their influence northward, clashing with the Heracleopolitan rulers in a series of military campaigns. By the time of Amenhotep II, Theban ambitions had crystallized into a clear goal: reunify Egypt. Amenhotep launched a sustained campaign to defeat the northern rulers and consolidate power under his rule. After years of conflict, he succeeded. Around 2000 BCE, he declared himself the sole ruler of a united Egypt, effectively ending the first intermediate period and initiating the Middle Kingdom. Amenhotep's unification was more than just a political victory. It was a symbolic restoration of ma'at, order, balance, and justice, which had been absent for generations. His reign marked the beginning of a renewed central government, a return to organized statecraft, and the re-establishment of royal control over religious institutions and provincial officials. One of the most significant outcomes of the first intermediate period was the change in how Egyptians viewed kingship and society. During the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh had been portrayed as an untouchable god-king, remote from ordinary life. But the experience of decentralization and local rule introduced a new perspective. In many provinces, local elites had taken on roles as community leaders, patrons of temples, and guardians of regional traditions. Their tombs, especially in places like Asyut, Beni Hassan, and El Bersha, were often inscribed with autobiographies. These inscriptions emphasized not the divine authority of a distant king, but the personal achievements, generosity, and moral conduct of the deceased. For the first time, individual merit, rather than royal favor, became a central theme in Egyptian funerary culture. This shift would have lasting effects. When the Middle Kingdom emerged, it incorporated these ideas into a more balanced vision of kingship, one where the pharaoh was still divine, but also portrayed as a just ruler, protector, and shepherd of the people. The lessons of collapse were not forgotten. New administrative reforms sought to limit the unchecked power of nomarchs and strengthen the center without completely erasing local authority. Despite its political instability, the first intermediate period was also a time of cultural resilience and adaptation. Local art styles flourished, especially in provincial tombs. Regional dialects and religious practices gained prominence. Even the construction of modest mud brick pyramids by some rulers of Heracleopolis shows a continued attachment to traditional royal forms, albeit on a smaller scale. The literary tradition also evolved. New types of texts emerged, including wisdom literature and philosophical reflections. These works, such as the Instruction of Hatshepsut or the Dialogue of a Man with His Ba, explored ethical dilemmas, the nature of suffering, and the fragility of human life. They reflect a society that had been through hardship and was grappling with deeper questions about order, fate, and justice. The first intermediate period thus stands not only as a chapter of decline, but as a moment of recalibration. It challenged the myth of unbroken divine kingship and forced Egypt to confront the consequences of over-centralization, environmental stress, and social inequality. From that reckoning, a new vision of governance and society would emerge. Out of the political fragmentation and regional rivalries of the first intermediate period emerged a new chapter in Egypt's long history, one characterized by consolidation, administrative reform, and a deeply reflective royal ideology. This was the Middle Kingdom, a period that began around 2000 BCE and lasted until approximately 1700 BCE. Though less monumental in architecture than the Old Kingdom, it was a golden age in terms of literature, statecraft, and national identity. The Middle Kingdom not only restored centralized authority, but also reshaped the concept of kingship itself. The story of this renewal begins with Amenhotep II, a ruler of the 11th dynasty based in Thebes. His success in reuniting Egypt, as discussed in the previous section, marked a political turning point. But his reign also laid the groundwork for the kind of pharaoh the Middle Kingdom would promote, less of an untouchable god and more of a wise and just guardian of the people. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, cut into the cliffs near Thebes, reflects both continuity with past traditions and a shift in artistic and religious sensibilities. The site, later chosen by Hatshepsut for her own temple, symbolized the Theban dynasty's enduring connection to divine legitimacy. After Amenhotep, the 11th dynasty continued for a few more reigns, but it was the 12th dynasty that truly defined the Middle Kingdom. Founded by Amenhotep I, this new dynasty moved the capital north to a site near modern-day Lisht, closer to the political center of gravity in Middle Egypt. Amenemhat named his new city Ichtawi, meaning Caesar of the Two Lands, and with this relocation came a renewed focus on unifying the diverse regions of the country under stronger centralized control. Amenemhat I had likely served as vizier before ascending the throne, and his understanding of administration shows in the reforms he enacted. One of his key policies was to restructure the role of the nomarchs, the powerful provincial governors whose unchecked autonomy had contributed to the chaos of the first intermediate period. Rather than eliminating these officials entirely, Amenemhat worked to balance their authority with that of royal appointees and created overlapping administrative layers that ensured loyalty to the crown. This administrative sophistication allowed the state to collect taxes, mobilize labor, and maintain public order far more effectively than before. His son, Senusret I, continued and expanded upon these reforms. Together, father and son ruled during a rare period of co-regency, which helped to ensure a smooth succession. This became a defining feature of Middle Kingdom governance, planning for stability by overlapping the reigns of the old and new kings. The 12th dynasty was also an age of engineering and irrigation. The rulers invested heavily in infrastructure, especially in the Fayum region, a large oasis west of the Nile. By building canals and controlling water flow, they turned marshland into arable farmland, expanding Egypt's agricultural base. These works not only fed the population, but also symbolized the king's role as the bringer of prosperity and balance, an upholder of Ma'at in a very practical sense. Beyond practical governance, the Middle Kingdom was a time of great literary flourishing. Texts such as the Tale of Sinuhe and the Instructions of Amenemhat reflect a deeper, more introspective understanding of kingship, fate, and personal virtue. The Tale of Sinuhe, in particular, follows an Egyptian official who flees the country after the death of Amenemhat I, only to return years later and be welcomed by the new king. The story combines political themes with emotional depth, exploring ideas of loyalty, identity, and reconciliation. Another significant literary text from this era, the Instructions of Amenemhat, presents a fictionalized message from the deceased king to his son. It warns of betrayal and the dangers of court politics, providing a more human view of royal life. Whether these works were historical or entirely literary, they reveal a society grappling with the balance between idealism and real-world complexity. Among the most powerful and influential pharaohs of this period was Senusret III. His reign marked a turning point in royal ideology. Breaking from the tradition of youthful and serene royal imagery, Senusret had his statues carved with stern, lined faces, depicting a thoughtful and burdened leader. This was a deliberate message. The pharaoh was no longer a distant, eternal figure, but an active, caring, and even suffering ruler, one who bore the weight of the nation's hardships. Senusret III was also a military reformer and an empire builder. He launched several campaigns into Nubia, Egypt's southern neighbor, and constructed a chain of forts along the Nile to secure trade routes and control movement across the border. These forts, with their meticulous planning and construction, stand as a testament to the logistical capabilities of the Middle Kingdom. Egypt's southern frontier was now clearly defined and tightly guarded. Culturally, this southern expansion had important effects. It brought Egyptian influence deeper into Nubia, but also exposed Egypt to Nubian customs, materials, and ideas. Trade flourished, and the Egyptian worldview expanded. At the same time, relations with the Near East grew stronger. Egyptian expeditions reached Byblos in modern-day Lebanon, importing prized cedar wood for construction and shipbuilding. Senusret III was succeeded by Amenhotep III, whose long and prosperous reign marked the peak of the 12th dynasty. He oversaw major building projects, including additions to the temple at Karnak and the construction of the so-called Black Pyramid at Dashur. But he is best known for his works in the Fayum region. His efforts to manage water and agriculture there were so successful that later Greeks credited him with creating the Fayum itself. However, even at its height, the Middle Kingdom faced challenges. Succession disputes returned after Amenhotep III's death, and the 13th dynasty, though a continuation of the Middle Kingdom in name, began to show signs of instability. Kings changed frequently, with some reigns lasting only a few years. Authority weakened, and the powerful bureaucracy that had once ensured order began to falter. The final blow came from outside Egypt. In the northeastern delta, a group of foreign rulers known as the Hyksos began to settle and eventually assert political control. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new period of division and foreign domination, leading Egypt into the second intermediate period. Still, the achievements of the Middle Kingdom left a lasting legacy. It had reimagined kingship, emphasizing justice, wisdom, and human connection. It had created a more flexible and resilient state system, one that could adapt rather than collapse in the face of difficulty. And it had nurtured a rich literary and artistic tradition that future generations would look back upon as a model. As the 12th dynasty faded and Egypt's once powerful central administration unraveled, the door was left open for a dramatic shift in power. The weakening of the Middle Kingdom's central authority, particularly during the later 13th dynasty, did not immediately lead to collapse, but it did allow space for new political forces to rise. Among these were the Hyksos, a group of foreign rulers who would come to dominate Egypt's northern regions and usher in the second intermediate period. The word Hyksos comes from the Egyptian term Heka-Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. While this might suggest invading armies, the reality was more complex. The Hyksos did not arrive in a single wave of conquest. Instead, their presence in the Nile Delta developed gradually. They were likely of mixed Semitic origin, with cultural and linguistic ties to the Levant, particularly the regions of Canaan and Syria. Archaeological evidence shows that by the late Middle Kingdom, people from the Near East had already begun settling in the eastern delta. attracted by Egypt's wealth and the fertility of the land. Initially, these settlers likely lived peacefully alongside native Egyptians, contributing as merchants, artisans, and mercenaries. But as central authority declined, these foreign communities grew in strength and organization. Eventually, their leaders began to wield real political power, establishing their own rule in the northern city of Avaris, located in the eastern delta. Avaris would become the capital of the Hyksos kings and the heart of their influence in Egypt. By the time of the 15th dynasty, traditionally attributed to the Hyksos, their control over Lower Egypt was firmly established. One of the most well-known Hyksos rulers was King Apepi, also known as Apophis. His reign, though foreign in origin, adopted many Egyptian customs. The Hyksos rulers styled themselves as pharaohs, used Egyptian titles, and worshipped some Egyptian gods. However, they also retained distinct cultural traits from their Near Eastern roots. For example, they introduced new weaponry, including the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot, technologies not previously used in Egypt. The Hyksos also brought innovations in fortification, bronze working, and possibly musical instruments and certain crops. Their rule was not simply a period of oppression or cultural interruption, as was once believed. Instead, it represented a fusion of traditions that had lasting effects on Egyptian society. Still, the presence of foreign rulers claiming pharaonic titles deeply challenged Egyptian ideas about kingship and national identity. For a civilization rooted in the belief that the pharaoh upheld divine order, the Hyksos rule was unsettling. In Upper Egypt, local rulers maintained autonomy, even as they acknowledged the Hyksos kings in name. Chief among these southern powers was the 17th dynasty, based in Thebes. At first, relations between the Hyksos and Theban rulers appear to have been uneasy, but relatively peaceful. However, tensions escalated over time. One famous episode, possibly legendary, describes a letter sent by Apepi to a Theban king, complaining that the hippopotamuses in Thebes were keeping him awake all the way in Avaris. The absurdity of the claim was likely a veiled insult, pushing for confrontation. Eventually, open conflict broke out. The Thebans began a campaign to drive the Hyksos from Egypt. This struggle would become a defining national cause and laid the foundations for Egypt's next great revival. The resistance was spearheaded by a sequence of Theban rulers, Sekenenre-Tau, Kamose, and finally Ahmose. Sekenenre-Tau is known primarily from his battered mummy, which bears severe head wounds, suggesting he died violently, perhaps in battle or assassination. Kamose, his successor, took a more aggressive stance. He launched military expeditions into Hyksos territory and recorded his campaigns in stelae, stone inscriptions that detail his motivations and victories. Kamose portrayed himself as a defender of Egyptian honor, rejecting the idea of bowing to foreign rule. He boasted of capturing Hyksos ships and taking their cities, but full victory remained out of reach during his reign. That task fell to Ahmose, son of Sekenenre-Tau and brother of Kamose. He completed the War of Liberation, pushing the Hyksos out of Egypt and pursuing them into southern Canaan. According to inscriptions left by his soldiers, most notably a man named Ahmose, son of Ibana, his campaigns were fierce and decisive. Ahmose laid siege to Avaris, captured the city, and later took the Hyksos stronghold of Sharuhin in the Levant. Ahmose's victories marked the end of the Hyksos presence in Egypt and the beginning of the 18th dynasty, initiating what historians call the New Kingdom. But the significance of the Hyksos period extends beyond military conflict. Their presence forced Egypt to evolve. The humiliation of foreign rule had deeply shaken Egyptian self-perception, and the response was a dramatic reassertion of native power, cultural identity, and military strength. The adoption of Hyksos technologies, especially the chariot and improved weaponry, would transform Egypt's military. These tools, once symbols of foreign dominance, became key assets in Egypt's own campaigns of expansion during the New Kingdom. The very instruments that once helped the Hyksos conquer would now be used by Egyptians to build an empire. The memory of the Hyksos lingered for centuries. Later kings used their expulsion as a justification for their own authority, portraying themselves as defenders of Egypt against outsiders. In temple inscriptions, royal propaganda, and even historical fiction, the Hyksos became a symbol of chaos, an aberration that the true pharaohs had set right. But beneath this narrative lay a more complex reality. The Hyksos period was one of interaction as much as conflict, innovation as much as disruption. The legacy of the Hyksos also shows how Egypt was never completely isolated. Despite its deserts and borders, Egypt was part of a wider network of cultures, peoples, and exchanges. Foreigners could rise within its borders, contribute to its development, and even claim its throne. This reality would repeat throughout Egyptian history, with future dynasties also tracing their origins to foreign lands. With the Hyksos expelled and native rule restored, Egypt stood at a crossroads. It could retreat inward, rebuild, and consolidate, or it could expand. The kings of the New Kingdom chose expansion. What followed was Egypt's most ambitious and outward-looking era, a period of conquest, empire, and unprecedented wealth. With the Hyksos finally expelled and Egypt once again under native rule, the country did not merely return to the ways of the past. Instead, it surged forward into a new and ambitious era. The New Kingdom, beginning around 1570 BCE with the rise of the 18th dynasty, was not just a restoration, it was a reinvention. Pharaohs were no longer content to maintain borders and build tombs. Now they sought to project Egyptian power beyond the Nile into Canaan, Nubia, and even parts of Syria. Egypt became an empire. The architect of this transformation was Ahmose, the first king of the 18th dynasty. His military victories against the Hyksos marked the start of the New Kingdom, but his accomplishments extended far beyond warfare. Ahmose reorganized the state, reopened trade routes, restored damaged temples, and initiated large-scale building projects. He understood that the legitimacy of his reign depended not only on military strength, but also on religious piety and visible acts of renewal. He revived the cult of Amun, the Theban god who had risen to prominence during the struggle against the Hyksos. Amun was now elevated to the status of a national deity, often combined with Ra, the old sun god, into Amun-Ra. Temples dedicated to Amun at Karnak and Luxor received lavish support, setting the stage for a powerful new alliance between the throne and the priesthood. Ahmose also set a precedent for rewarding loyal service. Individuals like Ahmose, son of Ibana, a naval officer who served in the Hyksos Wars, were granted land and titles. These personal accounts, recorded in autobiographical tomb inscriptions, offer invaluable insights into how ordinary soldiers and administrators viewed their role in the rebuilding of Egypt. Following Ahmose's reign, his son Amenhotep I continued the consolidation of power. Though less focused on military campaigns, he played a key role in establishing a stable succession and administrative control. He also began the tradition of being buried in the Valley of the Kings, a hidden necropolis on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. Unlike the pyramid complexes of earlier dynasties, these tombs were carved into rock and concealed from view, a new strategy to protect royal burials from looting. The full flowering of imperial ambition came under Thutmos I. He launched military expeditions both south into Nubia and northeast into the Levant. These campaigns marked Egypt's first major moves beyond its traditional frontiers. In Nubia, he extended control past the fourth cataract of the Nile, securing gold mines and subjugating local rulers. To the north, his armies reached as far as the Euphrates River, challenging the rising powers of Mesopotamia. These military successes were not just territorial expansions. They served as displays of dominance, reminding rival states that Egypt had become a force to reckon with. At home, Thutmose I commissioned ambitious construction at Karnak, where he erected tall obelisks and expanded the temple complex. These monuments served both religious and political purposes. They honored the gods while broadcasting the king's might to the people. Thutmose I's rise also presented a new problem: succession. His heir, Thutmose II, had a short and relatively undistinguished reign. However, it was during this transitional phase that one of the most remarkable figures in Egyptian history emerged: Hatshepsut, the king's daughter and wife of Thutmose II. While Thutmose II had a son, Thutmose III, by a secondary wife, the boy was too young to rule alone. Hatshepsut initially served as regent, but she gradually assumed full royal authority. Within a few years, she had taken the unprecedented step of declaring herself king, not queen. She adopted male royal titles, wore the traditional kilt and false beard of a pharaoh, and commissioned images showing herself performing the rituals of kingship. Hatshepsut's reign was remarkable not only for her political boldness, but also for its achievements. Rather than focusing on military conquest, she emphasized trade, diplomacy, and building. One of her most celebrated accomplishments was the expedition to Punt, a land believed to be located in the Horn of Africa. This journey brought back exotic goods such as myrrh, incense trees, gold, ebony, and even live animals, products that enhanced Egypt's wealth and religious rituals. The results of the Punt expedition were immortalized in reliefs on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. This temple, nestled beneath the cliffs of western Thebes, stands as one of the architectural masterpieces of ancient Egypt. It combined innovation in design with a strong religious narrative, presenting Hatshepsut as a divinely chosen ruler whose authority was sanctioned by Amun himself. Despite her success, Hatshepsut's reign was later subject to erasure. After her death, Thutmose III, now of age and ruling alone, removed many of her images and inscriptions. The motivations for this are debated, but it may have been an effort to restore traditional lines of succession or to reinforce the idea that kingship should remain a male institution. Thutmose III would go on to become one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs, but his era belongs to a later chapter. What began under Ahmose as a campaign of reunification had, within a few generations, transformed Egypt into an expansionist state. The pharaoh was now both king and conqueror, a master of ceremonies and commander of armies. Temples became centers of wealth and power, not just religious devotion. Foreign tribute, war spoils, and trade flowed into the Nile Valley, enriching the state and elevating the prestige of the crown. The 18th dynasty had launched Egypt into a new phase. It had embraced foreign policy, religious patronage, and elite reward systems to construct a durable imperial model. The successes of this early New Kingdom period laid the groundwork for future greatness and future complications. Among all the pharaohs in Egypt's long and complex history, Hatshepsut remains one of the most compelling. She was not the first woman to wield royal authority in Egypt, but she was the first to fully claim the throne as king in her own right and sustain her rule over a long and prosperous reign. Her story is not only about gender and politics, it is about statecraft, legacy, and the boundaries of tradition in a society that prized continuity above all else. Hatshepsut came to power during the early decades of the 18th dynasty, a period marked by renewed strength and growing imperial ambitions. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and the principal wife of Thutmose II. When her husband died, the throne passed to his young son by a lesser wife, Thutmose III. As the boy was still a child, Hatshepsut assumed the role of regent, a common arrangement in such situations. However, Hatshepsut's regency did not remain a temporary measure. Within a few years, she had adopted full pharaonic titles and began to rule as king, not as queen mother or co-regent. She was coronated with all the traditional rituals and appeared in public and on monuments wearing the symbols of kingship, the Nemes headdress, the uraeus cobra, and the false beard. In inscriptions, she was addressed with masculine titles and referred to as His Majesty. Why Hatshepsut made this extraordinary move is a subject of scholarly debate. Some argue that she was motivated by political necessity, that the state needed strong leadership during a vulnerable period. Others suggest that she was driven by personal ambition or a unique sense of divine destiny. Whatever the cause, her reign became one of stability, prosperity, and remarkable innovation. Hatshepsut did not rule in isolation. Her success was supported by a loyal and capable administration, most notably her close advisor Senenmut. He held numerous titles: steward, architect, tutor to her daughter Neferura, and was responsible for many of the building projects that defined her reign. Their close relationship has been the subject of speculation, but the evidence remains inconclusive. What is clear is that Senenmut was instrumental in implementing the queen's policies and in shaping her public image. A central theme of Hatshepsut's rule was legitimacy. Because she had taken a path that defied tradition, she worked hard to justify her kingship through religious and symbolic means. One of her most ambitious efforts was the promotion of her divine birth. In temple reliefs, she claimed that the god Amun had visited her mother in the form of Thutmos I and conceived Hatshepsut with divine intention. This narrative was not unprecedented in Egyptian theology, but in Hatshepsut's case, it served a political purpose: to portray her reign as ordained by the gods themselves. In terms of domestic policy, Hatshepsut focused on rebuilding and beautifying Egypt. After the long conflicts of the Hyksos period and the early wars of the New Kingdom, her reign marked a return to peace and internal development. She sponsored an ambitious building program, commissioning temples, shrines, obelisks, and statues throughout the land. Many of these projects were centered in Thebes, the spiritual capital of the New Kingdom and home to the powerful priesthood of Amun. Her greatest architectural legacy is the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, located on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Karnak. Designed by Senenmut, the temple is an architectural marvel, built in terraces that rise gracefully against the cliffs. It features colonnades, ramps, chapels, and reliefs that celebrate Hatshepsut's divine birth, her accomplishments, and her famous expedition to the land of Punt. The Punt expedition is among the most intriguing aspects of her reign. This trade mission, depicted in vivid detail on the walls of Deir el-Bahari, reached a region likely located along the Red Sea coast of modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. The Egyptians brought back valuable goods, including incense trees, gold, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals. These imports were not merely luxury items. They played a role in religious rituals, economic activity, and diplomatic prestige. By promoting trade and diplomacy over military conquest, Hatshepsut charted a course different from many of her male predecessors. That said, she was not averse to asserting Egypt's power when necessary. There is some evidence of military activity during her reign, including campaigns in Nubia and border regions. However, these actions were limited and appear to have been aimed more at maintaining order than expanding territory. Hatshepsut's reign lasted over 2 decades and brought stability, prosperity, and cultural flourishing to Egypt. But her unique position as a female king always stood somewhat apart from the norm. After her death, Thutmos III, now fully grown and ruling alone, began to remove her name and image from temples and monuments. Her statues were smashed or buried, her cartouches erased, and her legacy obscured. This posthumous erasure has long been interpreted as an act of revenge or a rejection of female rule. More recent interpretations suggest a more strategic motive. By removing Hatshepsut from official king lists and public monuments, Thutmos III may have sought to reinforce a stable line of male succession and ensure that future claims to the throne followed the expected order. Ironically, the attempt to erase Hatshepsut may have helped preserve her story. The deliberate damage drew the attention of later archaeologists and scholars, leading to her rediscovery in modern times. Her monuments, particularly the temple at Deir el-Bahari, remain among the most visited and admired in all of Egypt. Hatshepsut's reign defied expectations, not only because she was a woman in a man's role, but because she redefined what it meant to be a pharaoh. Her rule demonstrated that power in Egypt was flexible, rooted in tradition, yes, but capable of adaptation when circumstances demanded. She governed not through brute force, but through persuasion, legitimacy, and performance. She left Egypt richer, more stable, and more confident than she had found it. Her story, once nearly lost to time, now stands as a remarkable chapter in the long narrative of the pharaohs, a reminder that even in a society shaped by strict conventions, individuals could reshape history. With the death of Hatshepsut, Egypt stood at a critical juncture. Her unprecedented rule as a female pharaoh had challenged long-held traditions and ushered in a period of stability, wealth, and artistic grandeur. Now, her co-regent and successor, Thutmos III, emerged from the long shadow of her reign. Still young when he had been sidelined during Hatshepsut's rule, he was now poised to take full command, and he did so with unmatched ambition and military brilliance. Thutmos III reigned for more than 5 decades, making him one of the longest-serving pharaohs in Egyptian history. However, it is not the length of his reign that defines his legacy. It is what he achieved during it. He transformed Egypt from a regional power into a true empire, launching at least 17 known military campaigns and securing Egypt's influence from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates in the northeast. His reign marks the pinnacle of Egyptian territorial expansion. Early in his sole rule, Thutmos III faced the immediate challenge of asserting Egypt's authority abroad. During Hatshepsut's peaceful reign, many vassal states in Canaan and Syria had grown restless. Seeing an opportunity in the change of leadership, they began to test Egypt's reach. One of the most notable rebellions centered in the city of Kadesh, a key strategic site near the Orontes River. Thutmos responded swiftly. In his first major campaign, he led his army through a daring march across the Sinai and into the Levant. He famously chose the narrow, difficult route through the Aruna Pass, an unexpected move that caught the enemy off guard. At the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmos secured a decisive victory. The city itself required a lengthy siege, but in the end, it surrendered. According to inscriptions carved at the Temple of Amun at Karnak, the victory was celebrated as a triumph of strategy, courage, and divine favor. This first campaign set the tone for the rest of his military career. Over the following years, Thutmos returned again and again to the Levant, determined to assert Egyptian dominance and suppress any resistance. He subdued rebellious princes, established garrisons, and demanded tribute. His campaigns stretched as far as the Euphrates River, where he symbolically erected boundary stelae to mark Egypt's northernmost reach. In addition to his military actions in the Levant, Thutmos also conducted campaigns in Nubia. These expeditions were designed to secure Egypt's southern borders and control valuable resources such as gold, cattle, and slaves. He pushed further south than any of his predecessors, reinforcing Egyptian influence through a combination of force, diplomacy, and infrastructure. Forts were built, local leaders were integrated into Egypt's administrative system, and the wealth of Nubia continued to flow north. Thutmos's campaigns were not mere exercises in conquest. They were carefully orchestrated demonstrations of state power. He understood the importance of spectacle, and upon returning from each campaign, he offered tribute and spoils to the gods, especially Amun. This connection between military success and religious piety reinforced his legitimacy and the divine support behind his rule. At Karnak, he commissioned a series of inscriptions known as the Annals of Thutmos III. which recorded his victories in detail. These records offer historians some of the most comprehensive accounts of ancient Egyptian warfare. The influence of Thutmose III's campaigns extended beyond the battlefield. Through his victories, Egypt acquired a vast network of vassal states, tribute-paying cities, and foreign contacts. Luxury goods, exotic animals, and skilled artisans arrived in Egypt from distant lands. The cultural exchange enriched Egyptian art, architecture, and court life, introducing new motifs and techniques. At home, Thutmose III continued the massive building projects initiated by earlier rulers. He expanded the Temple of Karnak on a grand scale, constructing pylons, halls, and obelisks dedicated to Amun. One of his most striking achievements was the festival hall at Karnak, which included a botanical garden carved in stone, depictions of plants and animals he had encountered during his campaigns, catalogued like a living museum of empire. His building activity was not limited to Thebes. He left monuments throughout Egypt and Nubia, each reinforcing his authority and divine connection. He also constructed new temples and refurbished older ones, ensuring that his name and deeds would be remembered across generations. Despite his military and architectural achievements, Thutmose III remained politically pragmatic. He maintained Egypt's administrative systems, supported religious institutions, and worked to ensure a stable succession. Late in his reign, he appointed his son, Amenhotep II, as co-regent, a strategy that had proven effective for earlier rulers. This co-regency ensured continuity and allowed for a smooth transfer of power upon Thutmose's death. While much of his legacy was shaped by warfare, Thutmose III's reign also reflected a high degree of organization, planning, and statecraft. His empire was not held together by force alone. It relied on networks of diplomacy, marriage alliances, and shared religious practices. Vassal rulers were often kept in line not only by fear of military reprisal, but also through access to Egyptian prestige, goods, and ritual inclusion. His death marked the end of an extraordinary era. He had ruled for more than 50 years, led countless campaigns, built temples across Egypt, and left a legacy that few pharaohs could rival. Later generations looked back at his reign as a model of what a warrior pharaoh could achieve when guided by both divine mandate and personal ambition. In the centuries that followed, Thutmose III's reputation endured. He was remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a symbol of empire at its height, a ruler who had carried Egypt's banners farther than any had before, and who had done so while maintaining internal order and religious devotion. By the time Amenhotep III came to the throne, Egypt stood as the undisputed superpower of the Eastern Mediterranean world. The campaigns of his grandfather, Thutmose III, had secured Egypt's imperial boundaries, filled its treasuries, and elevated its prestige to heights no previous dynasty had achieved. But unlike his predecessors, Amenhotep III ruled not through war, but through diplomacy, opulence, and divine imagery. His reign, beginning around 1390 BCE, marked a different kind of greatness, one defined not by conquest, but by splendor. Amenhotep III ascended the throne as a young man, inheriting a stable empire and a well-organized administration. He was the son of Thutmose IV and the grandson of the great conqueror Thutmose III. His marriage to Queen Tiye, an intelligent and influential woman not of royal birth, was one of the first clear signs that his reign would challenge and reshape tradition. Tiye was not a mere consort. She was named Great Royal Wife early on and appeared in public and official contexts as a partner in rule. Her powerful presence in art and inscriptions points to a shift in the role of royal women during this period. Amenhotep III's reign was unusually long, lasting more than 3 decades. From the outset, he projected an image of divine kingship that surpassed even his forebears. He positioned himself not just as a god's representative on earth, but increasingly as a living God himself. This divine elevation was not accidental. It was part of a calculated ideological campaign that blended theology, architecture, and spectacle to reinforce the power of the throne. Nowhere was this more evident than in his construction projects. Amenhotep III was one of the most prolific builders in all of Egyptian history. He commissioned hundreds of temples, shrines, statues, and stelae. His building activity was especially concentrated in Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt. There, he expanded the Temple of Luxor and significantly added to the complex at Karnak. But his most ambitious project was his own mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile, once the largest religious structure in Egypt. Today, only the two towering colossi of Memnon remain standing. But in its time, the temple would have overwhelmed visitors with its size and scale. These colossal seated statues, carved from single blocks of quartzite, depict the pharaoh as a god-king gazing eternally toward the rising sun. Amenhotep III's interest in monumental art also extended to statuary. More than 200 statues of the king have survived, representing him in various forms. As a youthful ruler, a sphinx, a god, and a traditional pharaoh. These images flooded temples and public spaces, creating a kind of visual theology that declared his eternal presence across the land. Yet the king's ambitions went beyond the borders of Egypt. His reign is notable for its exceptional diplomatic activity. Rather than engaging in war, Amenhotep III cultivated a network of alliances with the great powers of the Near East, including Babylonia, Mitanni, and Hatti. Through letters inscribed on clay tablets, now known as the Amarna letters, we learn of the correspondence between Amenhotep and other rulers. These letters reveal a world of royal gift-giving, marriage negotiations, and subtle competition for prestige. Kings addressed each other as brother, sent gold and lapis lazuli, and requested Egyptian brides in exchange. In many cases, foreign rulers complained that Egypt sent too little or asked for too much. Amenhotep, confident in his kingdom's wealth, often reminded them of Egypt's superior status. He even declined to send Egyptian princesses abroad, breaking with precedent and reinforcing the exclusivity of royal bloodlines. This diplomacy helped to maintain peace across the region, allowing Egypt to grow rich from trade while avoiding costly wars. Goods flowed into Egypt from all directions: cedar from Lebanon, horses from Anatolia, silver from Mesopotamia, and incense from Punt. These imports adorned temples, palaces, and tombs, adding to the aura of divine prosperity that surrounded the king. Culturally, the reign of Amenhotep III was a golden age. Artists reached new levels of sophistication in sculpture, relief carving, and jewelry. Religious texts, hymns, and court poetry flourished. One hymn to the Aten, the sun disk, foreshadowed changes to come in the next reign. For now, however, traditional polytheism remained intact, with Amun at the center of worship. It is during this period that we see the first clear signs of theological experimentation. Amenhotep promoted his own divine image alongside the traditional gods, sometimes referring to himself as the dazzling sun disk. This subtle elevation of solar symbolism would later form the ideological basis for the religious revolution of his son, Amenhotep IV. Health records and mummified remains suggest that Amenhotep III suffered from arthritis and dental problems later in life. Despite these ailments, he continued to rule with vigor and maintained Egypt's internal and external stability. Toward the end of his reign, he celebrated 3 said festivals, ceremonial jubilees traditionally held after 30 years of rule to renew the king's vitality and reaffirm divine kingship. That he celebrated 3 of them in relatively quick succession indicates how seriously he took the idea of divine renewal. Whether viewed through the lens of politics, culture, or religion, Amenhotep III's reign represents a high point in Egyptian civilization. His blend of diplomacy, artistic patronage, and royal ideology set a standard that would be difficult to match. Yet the seeds of change were already beginning to sprout, both in the realm of religion and in the structure of state authority. His son, initially known as Amenhotep IV, would inherit an empire at the height of its power, but he would choose a radically different path, rejecting the old gods, moving the capital, and declaring the sun disk, Aten, as the only deity worthy of worship. In the long line of Egypt's pharaohs, one name stands out as a dramatic anomaly: Akhenaten. Born as Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, he inherited the most powerful and prosperous empire Egypt had ever known. But rather than continuing in the footsteps of his predecessors, Akhenaten broke sharply from tradition. His reign witnessed one of the most radical experiments in religious, artistic, and political thought in the ancient world. He rejected the established pantheon, elevated a single god, and reshaped the identity of kingship. To some, he was a visionary; to others, a heretic. Akhenaten came to the throne in the early years of the 14th century BCE. At first, he ruled in the conventional manner, worshipping the traditional gods, including Amun, the chief deity of Thebes. He maintained the capital at Thebes, participated in traditional rituals, and used the name Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied. But within a few years, a profound transformation began to unfold. Akhenaten began to shift his devotion toward a lesser-known solar deity, the Aten. The Aten, represented not as a human or animal form, but as a sun disk with rays ending in hands, had appeared before in Egyptian religion. Yet under Akhenaten, this god took center stage. The Aten was no longer simply one aspect of the sun god Ra. It became the sole god worthy of worship. By the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV had changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He abandoned Thebes and established a new capital city in Middle Egypt, midway between Memphis and Thebes. He called it Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten. Today, the site is known as Amarna. This new city was built with astonishing speed. Within a few years, temples, palaces, administrative buildings, and private residences rose from the desert. Unlike earlier religious centers filled with dark, enclosed sanctuaries, the temples of Aten were open to sunlight, with altars placed under the sky. Worship was focused on light, life, and the visible presence of the sun. The theological message was clear. The Aten was the creator of all life, and Akhenaten was his chosen intermediary. Traditional gods, such as Amun, Osiris, and Thoth, were marginalized, their images defaced or removed. Temples to Amun were closed, and the vast wealth of the Amun priesthood was redirected. The religious establishment that had underpinned Egyptian society for centuries was effectively dismantled. Akhenaten's religious revolution was accompanied by an equally startling artistic transformation. Royal images from this period departed sharply from traditional forms. Akhenaten was portrayed with an elongated face, full lips, narrow eyes, and a soft, almost androgynous body. Some statues showed him with a protruding belly, wide hips, and thin limbs, features that puzzled scholars for generations. These representations were not reserved for the king alone. His family, too, was depicted in an intimate, exaggerated style, often shown relaxing together under the rays of the Aten. Queen Nefertiti, Akhenaten's wife, was a central figure in this new visual world. Her name means the beautiful one has come, and her iconic bust, discovered at Amarna, remains one of the most famous images from ancient Egypt. She appears frequently alongside the king, performing rituals, receiving blessings from the Aten, and sometimes even acting as co-regent. Together, they ruled not just as monarchs, but as living conduits of divine light. Akhenaten's artistic and theological reforms were bold, but they were not universally accepted. Outside of Akhetaten, traditional religion quietly continued. In the south, in Thebes and other ancient cult centers, the old gods were never entirely forgotten. Even within Akhenaten's own court, evidence suggests a degree of tension. Tombs of officials at Amarna speak in the official language of Aten worship, but often reveal private loyalty to earlier beliefs. Meanwhile, Egypt's foreign relations began to show signs of strain. While Amenhotep III had cultivated diplomatic ties through extensive correspondence and gift exchange, Akhenaten appeared less attentive to the shifting dynamics of the Near East. The Amarna letters, clay tablets discovered in the ruins of his capital, reveal pleas from vassal rulers in Canaan and Syria begging for military assistance against hostile neighbors. These urgent requests often went unanswered. The reasons are debated, but Akhenaten's preoccupation with religious matters may have contributed to this diplomatic neglect. Domestically, the move to Akhetaten and the restructuring of religious institutions disrupted Egypt's administrative routines. The redistribution of temple wealth destabilized traditional economic systems, and the exclusion of powerful priestly families created resentment. While some officials prospered under the new order, others found themselves displaced. Despite these challenges, Akhenaten remained committed to his vision. For more than a decade, he ruled from Akhetaten, composing hymns to the Aten, commissioning artwork that reflected his unique worldview, and reshaping royal ideology. One of the most famous texts from this era, the Great Hymn to the Aten, praises the sun as the giver of life to all nations, peoples, and creatures. It emphasizes a universal message of creation, light, and order, a striking departure from the localized, ritual-heavy traditions of Egyptian religion. But the experiment was not built to last. In the final years of Akhenaten's reign, Egypt's position in the international arena weakened. Internal dissatisfaction grew. After Akhenaten's death, the succession became uncertain. For a brief period, a figure named Smenkhkare, possibly his son or son-in-law, ruled alongside or shortly after him. Then came Tutankhamun, a child king who would later change his name to Tutankhamun. Under these successors, the religious revolution was reversed. Akhetaten was abandoned, the capital returned to Thebes, and the worship of the Aten was officially ended. Temples to Amun were reopened, statues of Akhenaten were destroyed, and his name was omitted from king lists. Later generations referred to him obliquely, if at all, branding him a heretic whose reign disrupted the natural order. Yet despite this condemnation, Akhenaten's legacy endures. Modern scholars have debated his motivations and meanings. Was he a religious idealist, a political radical, or an isolated visionary? Was his depiction in art a reflection of a physical condition or a symbolic rejection of traditional norms? These questions remain open. What is clear is that Akhenaten's reign stands as one of the most extraordinary episodes in Egyptian history. He challenged a deeply rooted religious and political system, promoted a universal solar theology, and left behind a body of art and literature unlike anything before or after. His city, his vision, and his radical departure from orthodoxy make him one of the most studied and debated figures of the ancient world. In the wake of Akhenaten's religious revolution, Egypt found itself in a state of ideological disarray and political uncertainty. The grand experiment of Atenism had failed to take root beyond the royal court, and the capital city of Akhetaten had become isolated both geographically and culturally. Into this complex environment stepped a child pharaoh, Tutankhamun, whose reign, though short and largely unremarkable in military or administrative terms, would become one of the most famous in all of history due to the extraordinary discovery of his tomb more than 3,000 years later. Tutankhamun was born during the Amarna period, likely the son of Akhenaten and a lesser wife. His exact parentage remains a matter of scholarly debate, but genetic studies and archaeological evidence strongly suggest he was the child of a sibling union within the royal family. This practice of close kin marriages, intended to preserve the divine bloodline, may also have contributed to the many physical ailments observed in Tutankhamun's remains, including a clubfoot and other skeletal abnormalities. Originally named Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, the young king was installed on the throne around the age of 9. His reign began during a delicate transitional period when the country was eager to restore religious and political stability after nearly 2 decades of upheaval. He was too young to rule independently, so real power was exercised by senior advisors, including the Vizier-i and the military general Horemheb. These figures were instrumental in guiding the king's early decisions and restoring traditional institutions. One of the most symbolic actions of Tutankhamun's reign was the official rejection of Atenism. His name was changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling the return to the worship of Amun and the re-establishment of the Theban priesthood. This shift was not just a religious gesture. It was a deeply political move aimed at rebuilding the social contract between the king and the traditional elite. Temples dedicated to Amun were reopened and restored, and new cult statues were erected to reaffirm divine favor. The royal court abandoned the city of Akhetaten and returned to Memphis and Thebes, reinstating the symbolic and administrative centers of Egyptian power. Edicts were issued declaring the restoration of Ma'at, the divine order that had been disrupted during Akhenaten's reign. These proclamations emphasized that the gods had once again returned to their temples, the rituals had resumed, and Egypt was once more in harmony. Tutankhamun's court also began to re-establish Egypt's foreign relations. The Amarna letters reveal that during Akhenaten's reign, vassal states in the Levant had been left without support, leading to the erosion of Egyptian influence. Under Tutankhamun, efforts were made to repair diplomatic ties, though Egypt's international reputation had suffered. Military campaigns during this period were likely limited, and there is little evidence of major expansion or conquest. However, scenes on Tutankhamun's burial treasures depict him as a warrior king. Whether these were literal or symbolic remains uncertain. Despite the efforts to restore normalcy, Tutankhamun's health remained precarious. Modern examinations of his mummy have revealed multiple congenital conditions, including a cleft palate, scoliosis, and severe bone degeneration in his left foot. He likely walked with a cane, several of which were found in his tomb. There is also evidence of malaria and a possible fracture in the skull, which has led to ongoing debates about the cause of his death. While earlier theories proposed foul play, recent studies suggest his death was more likely the result of illness or injury rather than assassination. Tutankhamun died in his late teens after ruling for fewer than 10 years. His early death left Egypt without a clear heir and plunged the court into yet another succession crisis. The Vizier-i assumed the throne and married the widowed queen Ankhesenamun, likely to legitimize his claim. However, his reign was brief, and power soon passed to the general Horemheb, who positioned himself as a restorer of tradition and a military reformer. Although Tutankhamun's reign was not marked by grand achievements or major reforms, the discovery of his nearly intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings by British archaeologist Howard Carter in the year 1922 changed his legacy forever. The tomb, designated KV-62, had been buried under debris and overlooked by tomb robbers for centuries. When Carter opened the tomb, he found a dazzling array of treasures: chariots, thrones, jewelry, statues, and the now iconic golden funerary mask. The sheer wealth of the tomb provided an unprecedented look into the material culture of the new kingdom's royal court. While the tomb was modest in size compared to those of greater kings, its contents revealed the craftsmanship, symbolism, and spiritual life of the period in stunning detail. The mask of Tutankhamun, crafted from solid gold and inlaid with glass and semi-precious stones, became an international symbol of ancient Egypt. Yet the artifacts also raised questions. Many of the items in the tomb appear to have been repurposed or hastily prepared, suggesting that Tutankhamun's death was unexpected and that a grander tomb had not been completed. Some items may have been originally intended for other royals and were adapted for his burial. Even the outer coffin appears to have been made for someone else and then reinscribed with his name. These discoveries shifted scholarly understanding of the late Amarna period and the nature of royal burial practices. They also reignited interest in Egyptology and introduced the broader public to the richness of ancient Egyptian culture. The global fascination with Tutankhamun's tomb helped fund further excavations, promoted museum exhibitions, and shaped modern perceptions of Egypt's ancient past. Politically and historically, Tutankhamun's reign represents a moment of fragile recovery. It was a time when Egypt was healing from religious fragmentation and working to reassert the structures that had once brought order and prosperity. While his own agency was limited due to his age and health, the decisions made in his name laid the foundation for the subsequent stabilization of Egypt under Horemheb. Tutankhamun was a transitional figure, a symbol of rebirth both in life and in death. His name, nearly erased from history like that of his father, would ultimately become one of the most recognized in the world. Through the accidental survival of his tomb, he achieved in death what he never could in life: immortality. Rameses II, known to later generations as Rameses the Great, stands among the most celebrated figures of ancient Egypt. He reigned during the 19th dynasty in the 13th century BCE for an extraordinary span of nearly 7 decades. Few kings ruled longer, built more, or left behind a greater legacy. Yet his greatness was not simply a matter of duration. Through his military campaigns, architectural projects, religious symbolism, and sophisticated use of royal propaganda, Rameses crafted an image of eternal power that endured for millennia. Born into a prominent military family, Rameses was the son of Seti I, a capable pharaoh who had already restored much of Egypt's influence following the turbulence of the Amarna period. From an early age, Rameses was groomed for kingship. He was appointed co-regent with his father and held key administrative and military roles while still a youth. This early exposure to statecraft and command prepared him for the responsibilities he would assume as sole ruler. When Seti I died, Rameses II ascended the throne with confidence and ambition. Early in his reign, he launched construction on what would become one of his most enduring legacies: the city of Pi-Rameses, located in the eastern delta. This city became his northern capital and a vital military and administrative center. Positioned strategically near the frontier with Canaan, it allowed Rameses to oversee Egypt's imperial interests and to stage campaigns in the Levant. Indeed, war played a central role in Rameses' reign, particularly his early campaigns against the Hittites, a powerful Anatolian empire that had been expanding into Syria. The most famous of these confrontations occurred at the Battle of Kadesh, fought near the Orontes River in what is now modern-day Syria. This battle, which took place during the 5th year of his reign, was one of the largest chariot engagements in ancient history. Rameses marched north with a sizable force, aiming to retake Kadesh and assert dominance over the region. However, the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, had prepared an ambush. Egyptian forces were nearly overwhelmed, and Rameses himself was surrounded. According to Egyptian inscriptions, the king fought bravely, calling on the god Amun, and charging into the fray to save his trapped divisions. Reinforcements from a delayed Egyptian division helped turn the tide, and the battle ended in a military stalemate. While the outcome was indecisive, Rameses masterfully transformed the event into a personal triumph. He had the story of Kadesh inscribed on temple walls across Egypt, including multiple versions at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, and Abu Simbel. These inscriptions, often accompanied by dramatic reliefs, glorified the king's bravery and divine favor. The Battle of Kadesh became less a historical report and more a foundational myth of heroic kingship. Years later, recognizing the limits of perpetual warfare, Rameses signed a peace treaty with the Hittites, one of the earliest known international diplomatic agreements. The treaty called for mutual non-aggression and cooperation, and copies have survived in both Egyptian and Hittite archives. Sealing the accord, Rameses later married a Hittite princess, symbolizing a new era of diplomacy. While his military campaigns extended into Nubia, Libya, and even as far as the Sinai, it was in the realm of architecture and religious expression that Rameses II truly distinguished himself. He embarked on an unprecedented building program across Egypt and Nubia. His monuments were not merely large, they were designed to convey permanence and divine power. He completed the Ramesseum, his vast mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, filled with colossal statues, towering pylons, and inscriptions celebrating his deeds. His most iconic creation, however, lies at Abu Simbel, carved into a sandstone cliff in Nubia. The temple complex features 4 seated statues of the king, each over 60 feet high, flanking the entrance. Inside, a central sanctuary aligns with the rising sun on 2 specific days each year, illuminating statues of the gods and the king himself. This fusion of astronomy, art, and theology served to present Rameses not only as a mortal king but as a cosmic force. In addition to these monumental temples, Rameses restored and expanded many older sanctuaries, including significant additions to Karnak and Luxor. He inserted his name into older reliefs, sometimes replacing the names of previous rulers. This practice, while not unique to him, was particularly widespread during his reign and helped solidify his image across sacred and civic spaces. Rameses was also deeply engaged in religious life. He identified closely with Amun, Ra, and Ptah, and encouraged their cults through generous offerings and temple construction. Yet he did not restrict divine favor to the gods alone. He elevated himself as a god in life, not just in death. Statues and inscriptions described him as the strong bull, beloved of Maat, and Lord of Two Lands. His image was not simply symbolic, it was political and theological. In his vision, Egypt's prosperity, order, and divine protection flowed through him directly. In his personal life, Rameses maintained a large royal household. He married several wives, both Egyptian and foreign, and fathered dozens of children. Among his wives, Queen Nefertari held a special place. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most richly decorated in Egypt, its vibrant colors and poetic inscriptions a testament to her status. The temple he built for her at Abu Simbel, smaller than his own but still monumental, is one of the few in Egypt dedicated to a queen during her lifetime. Ramesses' longevity became a symbol in itself. He ruled for more than 60 years, outliving many of his children and successors. As he aged, he became a living institution, an embodiment of the state and its traditions. Foreign envoys came to his court with tribute, and Egypt remained a dominant cultural and political force in the eastern Mediterranean. When he died, he was buried in a grand tomb in the Valley of the Kings. His mummy, later moved by priests to protect it from looting, was discovered in a cache with other royal mummies and is now preserved in the Egyptian Museum. Even in death, Rameses continued to inspire. The Greeks identified him with their own hero gods, and later legends, including in biblical and classical literature, associated him with the Pharaoh of the Exodus, although no historical evidence confirms this link. In many ways, Rameses II succeeded in achieving what all pharaohs sought: eternal presence. His temples still stand, his statues still awe, and his name remains one of the most recognized from the ancient world. Through art, narrative, and religious performance, he turned his kingship into a lasting monument. The reign of Rameses II marked a high point in Egyptian power, culture, and imperial ambition. Yet even as his monuments rose and his image became synonymous with kingship, the forces that would undermine Egypt's stability had already begun to stir. In the decades following his death, a combination of internal weaknesses and external pressures brought the new kingdom into a long, uneven decline. The successors of Rameses II, beginning with his son Merneptah, faced challenges that were both practical and ideological. Merneptah inherited an aging empire and a bureaucracy that had grown complex, entrenched, and difficult to manage. Though he continued to present himself as a powerful ruler in the tradition of his father, his reign was marked by crisis management rather than grand expansion. One of the most notable events during Merneptah's rule was a conflict with the so-called Sea Peoples, a confederation of mysterious maritime groups who were moving across the eastern Mediterranean, raiding cities and destabilizing established powers. The origins of the Sea Peoples remain uncertain, but their impact was deeply felt. Merneptah defeated an attempted invasion in the Western Delta, as recorded in the Israel Stele, a monument that also contains the earliest known reference to a people called Israel. Although this victory preserved Egypt's borders, it highlighted the growing volatility of the international landscape. Across the Near East, kingdoms were falling to invaders, suffering economic collapse, or becoming engulfed in civil wars. Egypt's traditional allies and vassals were weakening or disappearing, leaving the empire increasingly isolated. Rameses III of the 20th dynasty would later face a more direct onslaught from the Sea Peoples. He is often seen as the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom. In the 8th year of his reign, he confronted a large-scale invasion from both land and sea. Egyptian reliefs at his mortuary temple in Medinet Habu vividly depict the battle, chariots charging, archers firing from fortified positions, and the Sea People's distinctive feathered helmets and round shields. Rameses III successfully repelled the attack and celebrated his defense of Egypt in grand terms. Despite these military victories, the cracks in the system were becoming visible. The cost of defense strained the royal treasury. Grain shortages and economic mismanagement led to discontent among the population and the working class. One of the clearest signs of the state's weakening authority came in the form of the first recorded labor strike in human history. Artisans working on royal tombs at Deir el-Medina stopped work to protest the late delivery of their food rations. Their complaints were not just about hunger, they reflected a breakdown in the administrative machinery that had once ensured order and reliability. Rameses III's reign ended in tragedy. A palace conspiracy, likely led by one of his secondary wives, Tiye, and involving high-ranking court officials, attempted to assassinate the king and place another son on the throne. Judicial records from the trial that followed describe a dramatic and violent plot, including the use of magic spells and recruited accomplices within the palace. The conspiracy failed, but Rameses III may have been fatally wounded. His mummy shows signs of a deep throat wound consistent with execution or assassination. After his death, Egypt entered a prolonged period of instability. The remaining kings of the 20th dynasty, many of whom were also named Rameses, were unable to restore the authority of their predecessors. Their reigns were often short, marked by economic decline, loss of foreign territories, and increasing power struggles within the elite. The once mighty Egyptian empire in Asia had effectively disintegrated, and control over Nubia was slipping. Perhaps more damaging than the loss of territory was the shift in political power within Egypt itself. During the New Kingdom, the priesthood of Amun, centered at Thebes, had grown immensely wealthy and influential. The temples controlled vast tracts of land, employed thousands of workers, and collected significant resources through offerings and taxes. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the high priests of Amun wielded power equal to, and sometimes greater than, the pharaoh. In Upper Egypt, the priesthood effectively governed in parallel with the royal administration. In some cases, high priests began to take on royal titles and build monuments traditionally reserved for kings. The line between divine service and political control blurred. Egypt had become a divided state in all but name, with the north governed by the weakening Ramesside kings and the south controlled by powerful priestly dynasties. This fragmentation created confusion over legitimacy. Multiple claimants to power emerged, and the cohesion that had once defined the centralized state eroded. Tomb robberies became rampant, including in the Valley of the Kings. Court officials sometimes participated in these crimes or turned a blind eye. The royal mummies themselves were eventually gathered, reburied, or hidden by priests seeking to protect them from looting. Some were moved to secret caches, where they would remain undiscovered for centuries. Culturally, the grandeur of the earlier New Kingdom gave way to more conservative and repetitive art. Statuary became less dynamic, temple reliefs more formulaic. While religious life remained active, innovation slowed, and a sense of nostalgia for earlier eras permeated official texts and rituals. The image of the pharaoh, once dynamic and creative, became increasingly hollow, a figurehead overshadowed by bureaucrats and priests. Diplomatically, Egypt lost its status as a dominant force. The Hittite Empire had already collapsed, and the Assyrians were rising to power in the east. Egypt no longer dictated terms on the international stage. Instead, it focused on maintaining internal control. The once grand system of vassal states and tribute had collapsed, replaced by localized rule and self-interest. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt had become a state struggling to remember its former greatness. It had endured invasions, internal revolts, economic distress, and the gradual hollowing of royal power. The centralized monarchy that had begun in the early dynastic period and reached its peak under the likes of Thutmos III and Rameses II was now in retreat. Yet Egypt did not vanish. What followed was not the end, but a transformation. New dynasties would rise, some native, others foreign. The ideals of kingship, the rituals of the temples, and the architecture of divine order would continue, adapted, reinterpreted, and sometimes challenged. But the long age of the empire, of conquering pharaohs and vast building projects, had passed. As the New Kingdom faded into memory, Egypt entered a new and complicated era. The centralized authority of the pharaoh had fractured, and different regions of the country were now controlled by competing power centers. Into this fragmented political landscape stepped rulers of foreign descent, first Libyans, then Nubians, who would each claim the ancient title of pharaoh. Though born outside Egypt's traditional heartland, these leaders embraced and revived Egyptian customs, presenting themselves not as conquerors, but as restorers of order and tradition. The first major shift came during the so-called Third Intermediate Period, a time stretching from roughly the 11th century BCE into the 8th century BCE. Egypt was no longer a unified kingdom under one ruler. Instead, it was divided between northern dynasties based in the Delta, Theban priestly rulers in the south, and a variety of regional governors with semi-autonomous control. This fragmentation created a power vacuum, and into it stepped a new elite, Libyan military families who had settled in Egypt generations earlier. These Libyan groups had initially served as mercenaries and soldiers during the late New Kingdom, particularly under Rameses III and his successors. Over time, they had settled in the western delta, intermarried with local populations, and taken on Egyptian titles and customs. By the time of the 22nd dynasty, these Libyan-descended leaders had become pharaohs in name and in practice. The founder of the 22nd dynasty was Sheshonq I, a former general and high official of Libyan descent. His rise to power was not through conquest, but through consolidation. He used his military credentials, family networks, and strategic marriages to gain support from both military leaders and priests. Once he took the throne, Sheshonq presented himself as a traditional pharaoh. He honored Egyptian gods, supported temple building, and adopted the formal iconography of kingship. Shashank I also attempted to revive Egypt's influence abroad. In the 10th century BCE, he launched a military campaign into the Levant. Biblical texts refer to him as Shishak, the Egyptian king, who attacked Jerusalem during the reign of Rehoboam. Inscriptions at Karnak detail a list of cities he subdued in Canaan, suggesting an attempt to reassert Egyptian prestige in the region. However, while Shashank achieved some military success, the larger problem remained unresolved. Egypt was still divided. After his reign, the country splintered once more, with rival dynasties ruling simultaneously from different regions. This period of multiple, often overlapping kingships made it difficult to track a single narrative of pharaonic rule. Some pharaohs controlled only a portion of Egypt, and many were challenged by competing local authorities. Amid this confusion, Thebes retained its importance as a religious center, even if its political power had waned. The high priests of Amun continued to wield influence and sometimes operated independently of the northern kings. In some cases, female members of the royal family were installed as God's wife of Amun, a religious office that carried significant authority. This role, while spiritual in name, became a tool for managing Theban loyalties without direct military confrontation. As Libyan rule weakened over time, a new force emerged from the south. Nubia, long influenced by Egyptian culture and religion, had developed its own powerful kingdom centered at Napata. For centuries, Nubians had worshipped Egyptian gods, built pyramids, and styled their rulers after Egyptian models. They saw themselves not as outsiders, but as the true heirs of Egyptian tradition, especially in contrast to the fragmented and often weak Libyan rulers in the north. The decisive moment came in the 8th century BCE, when a Nubian king named Pharaoh launched a campaign to bring Egypt under his control. His strategy was not merely military, it was deeply ideological. In inscriptions, Pharaoh portrayed himself as a restorer of Ma'at, cosmic order, and as a pious king chosen by the gods to rescue Egypt from chaos. Pharaoh's campaign was swift and effective. He marched north from Nubia, took control of key cities, and received the submission of several local rulers. One of the most remarkable records of this conquest is the Victory Stela of Pharaoh, found at his capital in Napata. The text blends military reporting with religious proclamation. Pharaoh is shown refusing to eat or wash until he has purified a defiled temple, emphasizing his spiritual mission. Importantly, Pharaoh did not establish a new capital in Egypt. Instead, he returned to Nubia after his victories, leaving local governors in place under his authority. This approach allowed for continuity in administration while asserting a new overarching authority. His successors, however, would take a more direct role in Egyptian affairs. Pharaoh's son, Shabaka, took the next step by consolidating control over all of Egypt and establishing the 25th dynasty. This dynasty, often called the Nubian or Kushite dynasty, ruled as fully Egyptian pharaohs. They wore traditional crowns, performed ancient rituals, and invested heavily in temple building and restoration. Their commitment to reviving Egypt's classical past was not superficial. It was central to their legitimacy. One of Shabaka's key actions was the preservation of ancient texts. The so-called Shabaka stone claims to be a copy of a damaged and decaying earlier inscription, reaffirming theological principles about creation and kingship. This concern with continuity and heritage reflected the dynasty's broader project, not to innovate, but to restore. The Nubian rulers also made efforts to re-centralize the government and reassert Egypt's authority in the region. King Taharqa, one of the most prominent of the 25th dynasty, engaged in both building projects and military campaigns. He constructed temples in Nubia and Egypt alike, and fought to defend his territories against the rising power of the Assyrian Empire. Taharka's reign, however, brought the Nubians into direct conflict with the Assyrians, who were now the dominant force in the Near East. The Assyrians viewed Egypt's growing influence as a threat and launched a series of invasions. Despite initial resistance, they eventually captured Memphis and forced Taharka to retreat to the south. His successor, Tutankhamun, made a final attempt to reclaim Egypt, but was ultimately unsuccessful. By the mid-7th century BCE, the Nubian dynasty had been pushed back into their homeland. While their rule over Egypt had lasted only a few generations, their impact was profound. They had restored a sense of sacred kingship, revitalized temple worship, and reconnected with Egypt's ancient ideological foundations at a time when native leadership had faltered. The presence of Libyan and Nubian rulers as pharaohs challenges simplistic notions of ethnicity and legitimacy in ancient Egypt. These leaders, though not ethnically Egyptian by descent, were accepted as rightful kings because they embraced the cultural, religious, and political roles expected of a pharaoh. In the worldview of the time, it was adherence to divine order and traditional forms that legitimized rule, not ancestry alone. As the 25th dynasty faded, a new challenge loomed on the horizon. The Assyrians, having destabilized Nubian rule, left Egypt open to further intervention. Native dynasties would reassert control in the delta, but their hold was tenuous. Foreign powers, now emboldened and increasingly aggressive, viewed Egypt as a prize ripe for conquest. By the early 7th century BCE, Egypt stood at the edge of a geopolitical storm. Internally weakened by centuries of fragmentation and externally challenged by aggressive imperial neighbors, the once mighty kingdom now found itself vulnerable to foreign domination. Among the new powers rising in the ancient Near East, none loomed larger than Assyria. With its capital at Nineveh and a reputation for ruthless military efficiency, the Neo-Assyrian Empire would bring unprecedented pressure upon Egypt, culminating in invasions, puppet rulers, and political upheaval. The decline of Nubian control over Egypt created a dangerous power vacuum. The last Kushite pharaohs, including Taharka and Tutankhamun, had attempted to defend Egypt from the advancing Assyrians, but their resistance only delayed what was quickly becoming inevitable. As Assyrian forces pushed westward from Mesopotamia, they encountered a fragmented Egypt ruled by competing factions. The opportunity to dominate this strategically critical region was too valuable for the Assyrians to ignore. The confrontation began in earnest during the reign of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon. In the early decades of the 7th century BCE, he launched a full-scale invasion of Egypt. Assyrian records describe the campaign with typical bravado, claiming that Esarhaddon captured Egyptian cities, looted treasures, and forced the pharaoh Taharka to flee south into Nubia. Memphis, the traditional capital of northern Egypt, fell to Assyrian forces, and Esarhaddon proclaimed himself king of Egypt. Yet despite these successes, holding Egypt proved more difficult than conquering it. The land was vast, the people resentful, and the local elites only loosely cooperative. The Assyrians tried to manage this challenge by installing local Egyptian princes as vassal rulers under Assyrian supervision. These local rulers were expected to collect tribute, maintain order, and report to their imperial overlords. When Esarhaddon died, his son Ashurbanipal inherited the throne and continued his father's policy. Ashurbanipal's reign is one of the best documented in Assyrian history, and his archives include letters from Egyptian governors and military officials reporting on local unrest and the difficulties of maintaining control. Despite the appearance of a functioning administration, Egypt remained deeply unstable. Tutankhamun, the last pharaoh of the Nubian 25th dynasty, attempted to reclaim Egypt after Esarhaddon's death. He marched north and briefly retook Thebes, signaling a final effort by the Kushites to restore their authority. However, Ashurbanipal responded with overwhelming force. His army invaded once more, sacked Thebes, the spiritual heart of Upper Egypt, and destroyed many of its temples and palaces. The sack of Thebes marked a symbolic turning point. For centuries, Thebes had been a center of religious, political, and cultural identity. Its temples had served as the stage for the great rituals of kingship, and its priests had shaped the very language of divine rule. Now it lay in ruins. The devastation shocked the Egyptian world and demonstrated the brutality and reach of the Assyrian Empire. In the wake of this destruction, the Assyrians installed loyal Egyptian princes in key cities. One of the most important was Psamtik, a local governor from the delta city of Sais. Psamtik had served under Assyrian authority, but used the chaos following the sack of Thebes to consolidate his power. With support from Greek mercenaries and native allies, he gradually asserted independence and established the 26th dynasty, often called the Sate dynasty, after his hometown. Psamtik's rise marked the beginning of a brief but significant Egyptian renaissance. Although he owed his initial authority to the Assyrians, he skillfully maneuvered himself into a position of autonomy. Over time, he expelled remaining Assyrian garrisons and reunited Egypt under his rule. The capital at Sais became a new political center, and Psamtik promoted a return to classical Egyptian ideals, reviving old art styles, restoring temples, and emphasizing connections to ancient traditions. Yet Egypt's independence under the Said kings was more precarious than it appeared. The memory of Assyrian conquest remained fresh, and the broader geopolitical environment was volatile. In the east, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was rising, soon to challenge Assyria for dominance. Meanwhile, in the Aegean, Greek states were growing in wealth and influence, establishing trading posts and colonies along the Mediterranean coast. Egypt, now under native rule once again, began to adapt to this new international order. Psamtik and his successors fostered trade with the Greeks and hired Greek soldiers as mercenaries. The growing presence of foreigners in Egypt, especially in the Delta, reflected the increasingly interconnected nature of the ancient world. Greek influence appeared in architecture, pottery, and military practices, especially in naval defense. Despite these efforts at renewal, the challenges of maintaining sovereignty in a world of expanding empires remained formidable. In the final years of the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire collapsed under the pressure of Babylonian and Median attacks. Egypt briefly supported the last Assyrian holdouts in the Levant, sending troops to aid them at Carchemish. But this intervention ended in disaster. The Egyptian army, led by Psamtik's son Necho, was decisively defeated by Babylonian forces under Nebuchadnezzar II. The Battle of Carchemish in the early 6th century BCE marked the final death of Assyrian power and signaled Egypt's declining ability to shape events beyond its borders. Although the Sate dynasty continued to rule Egypt for several more decades, its independence became increasingly fragile. The internal administration remained strong, and the arts experienced a revival of Old Kingdom aesthetics. Royal tombs, inscriptions, and statuary from this period consciously imitated earlier forms, invoking a sense of continuity with a distant and idealized past. Yet the geopolitical reality was stark. Egypt was no longer the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. It was now one state among many, proud, ancient, and culturally resilient, but politically vulnerable. That vulnerability would soon be tested. In the late 6th century BCE, a new imperial force emerged from the east. The Achaemenid Persians, under the leadership of Cambyses, set their sights on Egypt. Their advance would bring an end to the Sate dynasty and usher in a new era of foreign domination. But before that moment arrived, Egypt's rulers had one final opportunity to assert their legacy. The Sate kings, especially Necho and Apries, invested heavily in naval construction, attempted to build canals linking the Nile to the Red Sea, and reinforced Egypt's fortifications. These were not the actions of passive custodians, but of leaders who understood the stakes. They were determined to preserve Egypt's sovereignty, even as the tide of history turned against them. The Sate dynasty, formerly known as the 26th dynasty, represented Egypt's final chapter of native rule before it fell to successive waves of foreign domination. For more than 2,000 years, the pharaoh had stood as the supreme symbol of divine kingship, national unity, and cultural continuity. In this last native resurgence, beginning in the late 7th century BCE, Egypt's rulers made one final, determined effort to restore the glory of its ancient past while navigating the challenges of a rapidly changing world. The dynasty was founded by Psamtik I, who had risen to power in the wake of the Assyrian collapse. Initially a vassal under Assyrian oversight, Psamtik used a combination of military skill, diplomacy, and alliances with foreign mercenaries, particularly Greeks and Carians, to consolidate control over the entire Nile Valley. Once his authority was secure, he embarked on a cultural revival that blended political strength with reverence for tradition. Psamtik I sought to re-establish Egypt's position as a unified, independent kingdom. He strengthened central administration, reduced the power of regional warlords, and promoted the use of classical Egyptian styles in temple art, statuary, and inscriptions. Aware of the spiritual importance of continuity, he ordered restorations of ancient temples and encouraged scribes and artisans to model their work on Old and Middle Kingdom prototypes. This conscious return to tradition is often referred to as the Sate Renaissance. One of Psamtik's key innovations was his calculated engagement with the wider Mediterranean world. While maintaining Egyptian identity, he opened the country to foreign trade, particularly with the rising Greek city-states. Greek merchants and mercenaries were welcomed in key delta ports, such as Naucratis, which became a multicultural hub of exchange. The Greeks brought with them silver, wine, olive oil, and ceramics, while Egypt provided grain, papyrus, and luxury goods. This exchange was not only economic, it also introduced Greek ideas and technologies into Egyptian society, contributing to a gradual blending of cultures. Psamtik's son, Necho II, continued these policies and added new ambitions. He launched extensive infrastructure projects, including a major effort to dig a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, a precursor to the modern Suez Canal. Though incomplete, the canal was intended to promote trade and naval mobility between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Necho also expanded Egypt's navy, employing Phoenician shipbuilders and sailors to help defend the country's interests abroad. Under Necho, Egypt once again engaged in international politics. He sent military forces to support the fading Assyrian remnants in their final conflict against the Babylonians, a decision that led to Egypt's involvement in the Battle of Carchemish. This pivotal engagement, however, ended in defeat, as Babylonian forces under Nebuchadnezzar II crushed the Egyptian army and definitively ended Egypt's influence in the Levant. Despite the setback, Necho maintained internal stability and continued building projects that reinforced the royal image. Following Necho's death, his successors, including Psamtik II, Apries, and Amasis, attempted to preserve Egypt's sovereignty amid growing threats. Psamtik II undertook a notable campaign into Nubia, reaching the region of the Third Cataract and leaving inscriptions to mark the event. These symbolic gestures of power, however, could not reverse Egypt's strategic vulnerability. Apries, who ruled during a turbulent period, faced serious challenges at home and abroad. His reliance on foreign mercenaries, especially Greeks, alienated portions of the native Egyptian military and elite. When a military campaign against Cyrene in Libya failed, dissatisfaction among Egyptian troops erupted into a full-scale revolt. Apries was deposed by his own general, Amasis, who assumed the throne and tried to reconcile the divided factions. Amasis, also known as Thutmos II, proved to be a capable and pragmatic ruler. He strengthened the economy, encouraged agricultural production, and stabilized Egypt's social order. Like his predecessors, he upheld traditional religious practices and emphasized his legitimacy through temple construction and restoration. Amasis also continued fostering relations with the Greeks, granting them formal rights to reside and trade in Naucratis. During his reign, Greek philosophers and intellectuals, including figures such as Solon and possibly Pythagoras, visited Egypt, drawn by its ancient wisdom and cultural prestige. Despite this internal stability, the external threat to Egypt was growing rapidly. In the east, the Achaemenid Persian Empire had risen to power under Cyrus the Great and his successors. The Persians had already conquered the Babylonian, Median, and Lydian empires, and now turned their attention to Egypt. The challenge was passed on to Psamtik III, son of Amasis, who inherited the throne just as the Persian threat became imminent. Psamtik III was young and inexperienced. When the Persian king Cambyses launched his invasion of Egypt around the middle of the 6th century BCE, Egypt was not prepared for the scale or speed of the attack. The two armies met at Pelusium in the eastern delta. According to later Greek sources, the Persians employed psychological tactics, possibly involving images or even live animals sacred to Egyptians, such as cats, to disrupt enemy morale. Whether or not these stories are accurate, the outcome was clear. Psamtik's forces were defeated, and Egypt fell to Persian rule. Following the conquest, Psamtik III was captured and initially spared by Cambyses, only to be later executed after an attempted rebellion. With his death, native Egyptian kingship came to an end. Cambyses declared himself pharaoh and founded the 27th dynasty, inaugurating Egypt's first period under Persian rule. Although Egypt would occasionally reassert its independence in later centuries, no native dynasty would ever again establish long-term control over the country. The fall of the 26th dynasty marked more than just the end of a political era. It was the closing chapter of Egypt's ancient independence. The Sate pharaohs had made an earnest attempt to revive the ideals, institutions, and iconography of earlier ages. Their rule was characterized by deliberate continuity, cultural revival, and international engagement. They were not empire builders in the mold of Thutmos III or Rameses II, but they understood the symbolic power of Egypt's past and wielded it effectively to maintain internal cohesion. Even as foreign rulers took the throne, the model of kingship developed by the Sate pharaohs would endure. The Persians, Greeks, and later Romans adopted many Egyptian traditions, presenting themselves as heirs to the ancient pharaonic legacy. Temples continued to be built, rituals observed, and Egyptian priests maintained the ideological framework of divine rule, even under foreign dominion. With the fall of the 26th dynasty and the execution of Psamtik III, the ancient institution of native Egyptian kingship came to an end. Yet the idea of the pharaoh, more than just a political figure, but a divine presence responsible for upholding cosmic order, did not disappear. Instead, it was adopted and adapted by a succession of foreign empires, each of which laid claim to Egypt's legacy as both a sacred land and a strategic prize. The first of these foreign rulers were the Persians, whose king Cambyses entered Egypt after his victory at the Battle of Pelusium in the mid-6th century BCE. Cambyses declared himself pharaoh and was crowned according to Egyptian custom. He founded the 27th dynasty, known as the First Persian period. Though he hailed from far beyond the Nile Valley, Cambyses understood the symbolic importance of continuity. He made offerings to Egyptian gods, participated in traditional rituals, and portrayed himself in temple reliefs as a legitimate successor to the pharaohs of old. Nonetheless, Persian rule was viewed by many Egyptians with ambivalence, if not hostility. Cambyses' early tolerance was overshadowed by accounts of temple desecrations and harsh policies. Ancient sources, particularly those written by Greek historians such as Herodotus, depict Cambyses as a mad tyrant who insulted Egyptian traditions. While modern scholars debate the accuracy of these stories, there is little doubt that resentment simmered beneath the surface. Cambyses' rule was short-lived, and after his death, Egypt experienced a brief period of instability. The Persians eventually reasserted control under Darius I, a more capable and organized ruler. Darius undertook building projects, restored some temples, and completed the canal between the Nile and the Red Sea, promoting trade between Egypt and the Persian Gulf. Yet, even his more constructive policies could not erase the sense that Egypt was now a province rather than a kingdom. Rebellions broke out intermittently. Egyptian leaders who still believed in the ideal of native rule made several attempts to expel the Persians. One notable uprising occurred under a man named Arose, who allied with the Athenians and briefly reclaimed parts of the Delta. Though ultimately defeated, these revolts revealed a persistent desire among Egyptians to restore their own dynasty. By the late 5th century BCE, Persia's grip on Egypt weakened further. Eventually, local rulers managed to re-establish control and usher in a brief revival known as the 31st dynasty. However, this final native dynasty lacked the strength and resources to withstand renewed foreign pressure. When Persia returned under Artaxerxes III, Egypt was reconquered and once again made a satrapy, or province, of the Achaemenid Empire. This second Persian period was even less stable than the first. Persian kings exercised limited control, and Egypt's once thriving temples faced increasing financial and political restrictions. As the 4th century BCE wore on, a new threat emerged in the west, the Macedonians, led by a charismatic young general named Alexander. Alexander the Great, having conquered the Persian Empire, marched into Egypt in the year 332 BCE. To many Egyptians, he appeared not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Persian rule had become deeply unpopular, and Alexander, unlike previous invaders, showed immediate respect for Egyptian religion and customs. Upon his arrival, he traveled to Memphis and was crowned as pharaoh by the priests. He made sacrifices to Apis, the sacred bull, and presented himself as the rightful heir to Egypt's ancient rulers. From there, Alexander traveled to the Siwa oasis in the western desert to consult the oracle of Amun. The visit became legendary. There, the priests are said to have confirmed Alexander's divine status, calling him the son of Amun. Whether the encounter was religious revelation or political theater, it solidified Alexander's position as a legitimate ruler in Egyptian eyes. Alexander's interest in Egypt was strategic as well as symbolic. He founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. This city would become the most important in Egypt for centuries to come, serving as a center of trade, learning, and administration. Unlike older cities like Memphis or Thebes, Alexandria was built with a clear Greek design, featuring wide streets, royal palaces, and a massive harbor. While it did not immediately displace Egypt's older centers, its rise marked a fundamental shift in the country's orientation, from a Nile-focused kingdom to a Mediterranean power. Alexander's reign in Egypt was brief. He left to continue his conquests and never returned. After his death, his empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions. Ptolemy declared himself ruler and established a new dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Though Macedonian by origin, the Ptolemies adopted many of the rituals and symbols of traditional Egyptian kingship. They portrayed themselves as pharaohs in temple reliefs, made offerings to Egyptian gods, and supported the priesthood. Temples to deities such as Horus, Isis, and Hathor continued to receive royal patronage, and construction projects in places like Edfu and Dendera revived classical architectural styles. At the same time, the Ptolemies introduced Greek culture, language, and political systems. They ruled from Alexandria, spoke Greek, and built institutions modeled after Hellenistic ideals. The most famous of these was the Library of Alexandria, an ambitious project intended to collect all the knowledge of the world. Greek and Egyptian cultures coexisted, sometimes uneasily, in a society that was increasingly diverse. The early Ptolemies balanced these dual identities carefully. Ptolemy I and his immediate successors maintained strong ties with both Greek elites and Egyptian religious leaders. However, over time, tensions grew. Later, Ptolemies became more insular and authoritarian, relying heavily on Greek mercenaries and bureaucrats while neglecting Egyptian interests. Revolts broke out, especially in Upper Egypt, where resentment of foreign rule remained strong. Still, the image of the pharaoh endured. Even under Greek rulers, Egyptians continued to see their king as a divine figure responsible for maintaining Ma'at. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian traditions gave rise to new forms of art, religious syncretism, and political symbolism. One notable example was the deity Serapis, a hybrid god created to appeal to both Greek and Egyptian worshippers. As the Ptolemaic dynasty wore on, internal conflict and Roman interference began to undermine its stability. Egypt's unique cultural identity persisted, but its political independence had become increasingly symbolic. The once unified land of the pharaohs was now a multicultural province, its rulers balancing nostalgia for the past with the realities of foreign power. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt was no longer the dominant empire it had once been. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, it remained wealthy, culturally vibrant, and politically important, but it was also deeply entangled in the ambitions and rivalries of the Roman world. Into this fraught and unstable era stepped Cleopatra VII, a ruler who would become both the last of Egypt's pharaohs and one of the most enduring figures in world history. Cleopatra was born into a dynasty already on the edge of collapse. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, descended from Macedonian Greeks who had followed Alexander the Great, had governed the country for nearly 3 centuries. Though they portrayed themselves as traditional pharaohs in temples and ceremonies, their rule had grown increasingly disconnected from the Egyptian people. Internal revolts, court intrigue, and repeated interference from Rome had severely weakened the dynasty. By the time of Cleopatra's birth, Egypt was no longer an independent kingdom in any meaningful sense. It was a client state, subject to the whims of Roman politics. Cleopatra VII was born into this environment around the year 69 BCE. She was part of a royal family notorious for its deadly power struggles. Siblings often ruled jointly, then turned against one another in vicious political and even military conflicts. Cleopatra herself would eventually co-rule with 2 of her brothers in succession, both named Ptolemy, and later with her son. These co-regencies, however, were rarely equal or peaceful. What set Cleopatra apart from other Ptolemies was her intelligence, ambition, and cultural adaptability. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in centuries to learn the Egyptian language and fully embrace the religious and ceremonial role of the pharaoh. She presented herself as the living embodiment of Isis, the divine mother goddess, and actively participated in Egyptian religious rites. At the same time, she was highly educated in Greek philosophy, literature, astronomy, and medicine, and fluent in multiple languages. Her court at Alexandria attracted scholars, diplomats, and thinkers from across the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra came to the throne as co-ruler with her father, Ptolemy XII, and later with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. But her authority was soon challenged by court officials and Roman advisors who favored her brother. Civil war broke out between the 2 siblings, threatening not only her position, but the stability of Egypt itself. It was during this conflict that Cleopatra met Julius Caesar, the Roman general and dictator whose arrival in Alexandria in 48 BCE would change the course of her life and of Egypt's history. Cleopatra famously arranged to meet Caesar in secret, possibly smuggled into the palace concealed in a rug or linen sack. However embellished this tale may be, the political outcome was clear. Caesar backed Cleopatra's claim to the throne. With Roman support, Cleopatra regained power. Ptolemy XIII was killed during the ensuing conflict, and Cleopatra was restored as queen, now ruling jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV. She also became Caesar's lover and later bore him a son, Caesarion, whom she named co-regent. For Cleopatra, this relationship was both personal and strategic. It strengthened her position in Egypt while aligning her with the most powerful man in the Roman world. Cleopatra later traveled to Rome, where she lived for a time in one of Caesar's estates. Her presence there caused a scandal among the Roman elite. She was seen by many as an exotic queen meddling in Roman affairs, a foreigner who posed a threat to the traditional order. Nevertheless, her time in Rome helped solidify her reputation as a shrewd political operator and a queen capable of navigating the intricacies of imperial power. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE shattered Cleopatra's plans. She returned to Egypt, where her co-ruler Ptolemy XIV died under suspicious circumstances. She then named her son Caesarion as her co-ruler, presenting him as the rightful heir to Julius Caesar's legacy. In the years that followed, Cleopatra formed another critical alliance, this time with Mark Antony, one of Caesar's top generals and a leading figure in the power struggle that followed his death. Antony, who was married to the sister of his rival Octavian, later Augustus, began a political and romantic partnership with Cleopatra that would become the stuff of legend. Together, they ruled the eastern Mediterranean, with Cleopatra controlling Egypt and Antony overseeing Roman territories in the east. Their alliance was not simply personal. It was a calculated bid to create a powerful counterweight to Octavian's growing influence in Rome. Cleopatra supported Antony militarily and financially, providing ships, troops, and resources for his campaigns. The two presented themselves as living gods, Cleopatra as Isis and Antony as Dionysus, and celebrated their union with lavish ceremonies. They had 3 children together and envisioned a new political order in which their combined territories would dominate the Roman world. Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, was proclaimed King of Kings, a title that openly challenged Roman authority and signaled ambitions far beyond Egypt's traditional borders. Octavian, however, used this alliance as a political weapon. In Rome, he portrayed Antony as a traitor seduced by a foreign queen. He launched a propaganda campaign that framed Cleopatra as the true enemy, a manipulative seductress who threatened Rome's moral and political order. These attacks culminated in open war. In 31 BCE, Octavian's forces faced those of Antony and Cleopatra at the naval battle of Actium. The conflict, fought off the western coast of Greece, ended in disaster for the Egyptian-Roman alliance. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated, and their forces fled. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt directly. As Octavian's army approached Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra prepared for the inevitable. According to later sources, Antony, believing Cleopatra had already taken her life, fell on his own sword. He died in her arms. Cleopatra, determined to avoid humiliation in a Roman triumph, also chose death, most likely by poison, though the romantic legend of an asp bite has endured. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, the line of pharaohs that had ruled Egypt for over 3,000 years came to an end. Her son Caesarion was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. Egypt was formally annexed by Rome and became a Roman province, administered by governors appointed by the emperor. Despite the end of her reign, Cleopatra's legacy endured. She was remembered, sometimes vilified, sometimes idealized, as one of the most brilliant, complex, and charismatic rulers in history. Later writers turned her life into drama and myth, from Roman poets to Renaissance playwrights to modern filmmakers. Yet beneath the legend stands a real and remarkable woman, a queen who spoke the language of her people, who ruled as both priestess and politician, and who made one last stand for Egyptian sovereignty in a world dominated by foreign empires. With Cleopatra, the story of the pharaohs came to its final human end. From the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by Narmer more than 3 millennia earlier to the fall of Alexandria to Rome, the pharaohs had shaped not only Egypt but the imagination of civilizations that followed. Though their rule ended, their legacy, carved in stone, written in gold, and preserved in myth, remains eternal, remains eternal.